The light cruisers of the Royal Navy are an interesting bunch. Quite a few of these ships were built over the years. However, only a few names have endured, such as, for example, Belfast, for obvious reasons, or her sister Edinburgh for how she was sunk. Then there are ships like Sydney, Achilles, or Perth that were built by the British but served in Commonwealth navies. Yet, despite giving good service, a lot of these ships are overlooked by popular history. For example, the topic of today's video, HMS Fiji. Aside from her virtual counterpart in World of Warships, this vessel rarely comes up, unless you're specifically studying the Battle of Crete for reasons that will be apparent later. In fairness, that's likely because Fiji had a short and admittedly unfortunate career. To me, that just makes her story much more interesting. Despite some severe damage, she returned to battle after repair and fought until literally running out of ammunition. That's a story worth remembering, if you ask me. But of course, all of that comes later. First, we have to begin on March 30th, 1938, at the John Brown shipyard. The ship that became Fiji was laid down there, where a fast construction period would follow. The cruiser was launched a little over a year later, on May 31st of 1939, and then commissioned almost exactly another year later on May 5th, 1940, when the Second World War was well underway, which does mean that Fiji is another one of those ships that has no peacetime career. The war broke out while she was fitting out, and she was thrown right into it. The same goes for her entire class, as Fiji is the nameship of the Fiji-class cruisers. Alternatively, the Crown Colony class. These ships originated out of the London Naval Treaty. Among other things, the British tried to hold to a new cruiser limit of 8,000 tons. This would result in several different designs, all trying to cram as much on that limited weight as humanly possible. For example, by swapping the 4 triple turrets of the Town class for 3 quadruple turrets. Various other layouts were also pondered, but a common issue was the displacement going up to 8,500 or even 9,000 tons. Cutting down on armor, length, and scout aircraft could bring the tonnage down, even to the desired 8,000 tons, while retaining 10 guns, and still having a decently well-protected ship capable of 32.5 knots. This showed some ingenious design work, to say the least, although, as the final design showed, probably fairly cramped. Further design work would follow as the British experimented with various combinations of armor, firepower, and speed. There was even a stage where the design looked more like a scaled-up Dido, with 5.25-inch guns, and a lot of them. 7 twin turrets with a total of 14 barrels. Like this is the second coming of HMS Agincourt in cruiser form. Except instead of a long ship with spread out turrets, this cruiser design, or designs, went a different route. The first option had 4 turrets super firing on the bow, one over the other, and a set of 3 on the stern. Another option went for the same 4 bow turrets, but with 2 of them carried side by side, with a super firing turret over them and a 4th on the lowest level, most similar to the post-war French cruisers de Grasse and Colbert. But those ships had a super firing pair and then the side-by-side mounts. For his part, Friedman also references a further design which had no fewer than 8 turrets. basically a mirrored version of the first design, but I haven't seen a sketch for this one. Perhaps fortunately for the British, these designs went nowhere. Ultimately, the final design was best described as a smaller Southampton, that being the first of the town's subclasses for those curious. This final design displaced about 1,000 less tons compared to a town, 8,253 tons at standard loading compared to a bit over 9,000 on HMS Southampton. This resulted in a good but flawed ship, although it's worth noting that Friedman cites 8,630 tons as built, so they gained a bit of weight. As another comparison, Fiji was 555 feet, 169 meters long, compared to 591 feet, or 180 meters on Southampton. A good bit of that lost length coming from adopting a transom stern. In beam, Fiji was actually very slightly wider at 62 feet, 19 meters, compared to 61 feet, 8 inches, or 18.8 meters. The draft was much shallower, though, at 16 feet, 6 inches, 5 meters, compared to 21 feet, 6 inches, 6.55 meters on Southampton. On that displacement, Fiji carried the exact same main battery as her larger cousin, at least at first. This consisted of 12 6-inch, 152mm guns in 4 triple turrets, a super-firing pair on the bow and a pair on the stern. To support these, the ship carried 8 4-inch, 102mm guns in 4 twin mountings by the aft superstructure, with offensive weaponry rounded off by 2 triple torpedo tubes. Defensive weaponry, then, initially consisted of 2 quadruple 40mm pom-poms, as well as 2 quad 50 caliber machine guns. This would be reinforced on the later ships of the class as the war went on. Not so much on Fiji herself, as we'll see. Similarly, as a final note on weaponry, the later ships would ditch the aft super-firing turret for stability reasons, but also to fit more dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry. As for the base design, let's finish things off with armor and speed. First, the armor. This was reduced from 4.5 inches on Southampton to 3.5 on Fiji's main belt, with 2 inches on the deck. As for the speed, this remained about the same, 32 to 32.5 knots on 80,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. It should also be noted, as you imagine with them ditching a turret entirely, that this was a very tight design. The Fijis didn't have much space or spare stability. One of the dangers of trying to cram as much as possible on as little tonnage as you can get away with. Still not nearly as bad as, for example, the infamous Tomozuru, but the point remains. Regardless, that rounds off the design, so let's go to service, which for HMS Fiji would be rather short. Like I mentioned at the start, Fiji was completed in May 1940, with the ship properly entering service in July of the same year. By this point, the Second World War was well underway, at least in Europe. So, Fiji was kept close to home, at least at first. This would last from when her trials ended in July 1940 to the end of August. Things were supposed to change at that point. Fiji was transferred from the home fleet to support the attack on French Dakar, one of several engagements between British and Vichy French forces. However, Fiji would not actually participate in the attack. She left home on August 30th and joined up to escort transports on August 31st. All well and good. But then on September 1st, 1940, Fiji was torpedoed by U-32. It does take some exceptionally bad luck to be immediately torpedoed the moment you leave home waters. Fortunately, while the damage was severe, it wasn't enough to sink her. Fiji was hit near the forward boiler room. This wrecked that boiler room and flooded a nearby compartment. Fiji was able to keep moving at 11 knots, but the ship did pick up a pretty severe list to port. Severe enough that her crew threw ammunition overboard and jettisoned the port torpedoes. That tight design was a real concern here. Still, Fiji's crew managed to keep their ship afloat. She was escorted home, including by HMS Punjabi, as I covered in that video. And once home, Fiji went in for a lengthy period of repair and overhaul. The British took the chance to add new radar and another pair of quad 50 caliber mounts. Between the repairs, the modifications, and post-refit trials, Fiji only returned to service in March of 1941. Initially, she stuck close to home. Fiji patrolled for German raiders, with particular attention paid to the Denmark Strait. However, she wouldn't catch anything. The closest she came was Admiral Scheer at the end of March, but the German Panzerschiff made it home without being engaged. So Fiji rounded out the month of March on patrol with HMS Hood to cover the Gibraltar convoy route, with Fiji reassigned to Gibraltar and Force H at the conclusion of this in early April, primarily on patrol duty, but also escorting Malta supply runs, including by Ark Royal at the end of the month. That said, her time in Gibraltar would prove short, with the cruiser sent on into the Mediterranean on May 6, 1941. She formed part of the escort for HMS Queen Elizabeth, arriving at Alexandria on May 12th, to almost immediately be sent on to Crete to support the defense there on May 15th, which would, as it turned out, be Fiji's final mission. The ship sailed for Crete as part of Force B with the cruiser Gloucester and the destroyers Havoc and Hotspur, with this force joining up with HMS Warspite and Valiant west of Crete on May 21, 1941. It didn't take long for German air attacks to begin later that day. Those initial attacks failed to do much in the way of damage, but they did cost the British quite a lot of anti-aircraft ammunition. That would become a critical problem soon enough, as in the next day. On May 22nd, German air attacks intensified, with the first attacks around dawn knocking out Fiji's anti-aircraft director. After this, the cruiser joined up with other British forces, all of which were running low on anti-aircraft ammunition, ranging from a high of 40% on HMS Ajax to a low of 18% on Gloucester. Yet the British kept Gloucester and Fiji herself at 30% stock near Crete. Over the course of the day on May 22nd, German air attacks continued. Eventually, Fiji and Gloucester were detached to cover two destroyers, Kandahar and Kingston. Those ships were rescuing survivors of the sunken HMS Greyhound and needed cover from air attack. Cover that the two cruisers were arguably incapable of providing, especially when the Germans subjected those four ships to almost constant air attack for hours. The result is perhaps predictable. Fiji was out of ammunition for her 4-inch guns by 3:30 that afternoon. Gloucester would be crippled by German bombers around 3:50 forcing Fiji to leave her behind. This wouldn't save her. At around 7 p.m., Fiji suffered a hit that flooded her forward boiler room. Again, along with the forward engine room. This slowed the cruiser down to 18 knots and caused a severe list. A list that grew worse when the ship was hit again. This would increase the list to 30 degrees, prompting an order to abandon ship. Fiji would eventually capsize around 7:30, with the destroyers picking up the survivors after dark. 523 men were plucked from the water, in what has, in the years since, been considered something of an avoidable tragedy, due to remaining in the area on such a low supply of ammunition. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.